Here we go. Grimm Tales. The one we're reading today is called The Riddle. Once there was a prince who took it into his head to travel about the world, taking no one with him but a faithful servant. One day they came to a great forest, and when evening came they could find no place to shelter. They didn't know where they could spend the night. But then the prince saw a little house, and walking towards the house there was a girl, and as they came closer they saw that she was young and beautiful. Hey, Dansky, I've just started the story, so you're not that late. They went travelling. They found a young, beautiful girl in a cottage. That's all that you've missed. He caught up with her and said, "Tell me, miss, can my servant and I find shelter for the night in that little house?" "Yes," she said sadly, "you can, but I don't think it's a good idea. I wouldn't go in if I were you." "Why ever not?" asked the prince. The girl sighed. "My stepmother lives there," she said, "and she practices the evil arts. What's more, she doesn't like strangers. But if you must go in, don't eat or drink anything she offers you." The prince realized that this was the house of a witch, but it was dark and they couldn't go any further, and besides, he was afraid of nothing. So he knocked and went in. The old woman was sitting in an armchair by the fire, and when she looked at the prince her eyes glowed like the coals. "Good evening, young sirs," she said in her friendliest voice. "Sit down and rest yourselves." I like how he just walked in and didn't wait until he was invited. I'm just saying. She blew on the fire and stirred something in a little pot. Because of the girl's warning, the prince and his servant didn't eat or drink anything. They wrapped themselves up and slept soundly till morning. When morning came, they got ready to leave. The prince was already mounted on his horse when the old woman came out and said, "Wait a minute, just let me give you a little drink to see you on your way." When she went back into the house, the prince rode away, but the servant had to tighten the girth of his saddle, and he was still there when the witch came out with the drink. "Here you are," she said. "Take this to your master." But he had no time to do that, because as soon as he took it from her hand the glass burst and the drink splashed onto his horse. It was poison, of course, and it was so strong that the poor animal fell dead at once. The servant ran after the prince and told him what had happened, and he'd have left with the prince right there and then, except that he didn't want to abandon his saddle. Obviously. Weird. So he went back to get it. When he reached the dead horse, he found a raven already perching on its head and pecking out its eyes. Who knows? We might find nothing better to eat today, he thought. So he killed the raven and took it with him. They wandered in the woods all day long, but they couldn't find their way out. As night fell, they came to an inn, and the servant gave the raven to the innkeeper and told him to prepare it for their supper. I don't know how I feel about eating ravens. That seems like you're asking for bad luck. Is that just me? I don't know. It doesn't seem like a good idea to me. Now what they didn't know was that they'd fallen into a den of brigands, murderers in fact, and just as the prince and his servant were sitting down, 12 of these rascals turned up, meaning to do away with them. But seeing the supper arrive, the murderers thought they might as well eat first. It was the last meal they ever had, for they hadn't swallowed more than a mouthful of the raven's stew when they all fell dead. The poison in the horse had been so strong that it had passed on to the raven, and that had been enough to kill every one of them. See, unlucky to eat ravens, don't do it. The innkeeper had fled, seeing what had happened, and there was no one left in the house but the innkeeper's daughter. She was a good girl, and had had nothing to do with the murderers and their wickedness. She unlocked a hidden door and showed the prince all the treasure they'd stolen, piles of gold and silver and mounds of jewels. The prince said she should keep it for herself. He wanted nothing to do with it. Sorry. And once again he and his servant rode on their way. They travelled about for a long time, and one day they came to a town where there was a princess who was both very beautiful and very proud. She had announced that she would marry any man who asked her a riddle that she couldn't solve. However, if she managed to solve it to the satisfaction of 12 wise riddle masters, his head would be cut off. Hey, Sparrow! She would have 3 days to think about it, but she was so clever that she always solved it long before that time was up. Already 9 men had tried to beat her, but each of them had lost his head. However, that didn't worry the prince. He was so dazzled by her great beauty that he was willing to risk his life. He went to the palace and asked his riddle. "One killed none," he said, "but still killed 12. What is it?" She had no idea what it could be. She thought and thought, but nothing came to mind. She consulted all her riddle books, but there had been nothing like it in all the history of riddles. It seemed as if she'd met her match at last. However, she wasn't willing to give up, so that night she sent her chambermaid to creep quietly into the prince's bedroom. There she had to listen carefully to anything he said in his sleep, in case he revealed the answer to the riddle in his dreams. That is cheating. I lost my train of thought because you're accusing the princess of cheating. She's using the resources available to her. There she had to listen carefully to anything he said in his sleep, in case he revealed the answer to the riddle in his dreams. But that came to nothing, because the prince's servant had taken his place, and when the maid came in, he snatched away the robe she'd covered herself with and chased her away with a stick. So that didn't work. Oh my God. On the second night she sent another maid to see if she'd be any more successful. His servant took her robe as well and chased her away with an even bigger stick, so that didn't work either. On the third night the prince decided to wait and watch himself. This time the princess came herself. She was wearing a beautiful mist-grey robe, and she sat down softly on the bed next to him and waited till she was sure he was asleep. But he was still awake, and when she whispered, "One killed none, what is that?" he answered, "A raven ate the flesh of a horse that was poisoned and died itself." Then she said, "But still killed 12, what does that mean?" He answered, 12 murderers ate a stew made from the raven and died of it." She was sure she had the answer now, and she tried to tiptoe away, but the prince caught hold of her robe and held it so tight that she had to leave it behind. Next morning the princess announced that she had solved the riddle. She sent for the 12 riddle masters and told them what it meant. It looked as if the prince was doomed, but he asked to be heard. "The princess came into my room when she thought I was asleep," he said, "and asked me what the answer was. She would never have guessed it otherwise." The riddle masters conferred together and said, "Have you any proof?" Then the prince's servant brought in the 3 robes. When the riddle masters saw the mist-grey one, which no one but the princess ever wore, they said, "Have this robe embroidered with gold and silver, your highness, for it will be your wedding gown. The young man has won." Ah, that's the end of the story. I thought there might be more to it, but that's it.